Hey friends, tonight we're about to dive into one of history's strangest but most fascinating chapters. Female pirates, women who refused to be confined by the expectations of their era. Instead, they chose to board ships, wield swords, and leave the Royal Navy scratching its head. Yet the most intriguing part isn't their daring raids. It's what happened when they were captured, because that's when the law didn't know how to handle them. As men, as women, or as a gigantic, skirt-wearing, dagger-wielding nuisance. Before we set sail, take a second to hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly find these stories compelling. And don't forget to comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, dim the lights, relax, and prepare to embark. You step into a 17th century courtroom. Powdered wigs loom overhead. Bewildered faces turn as though someone has just uttered the words woman and captain in the same breath. When a pirate was caught, the trial usually blew through like a sea breeze. Arraign, convict, hang, done. But when the defendant is a woman, wearing breeches, wielding a sword, even daring to give orders to men, everything becomes so strange it borders on farce. The laws of the time, originally crafted to curb drunken sailors and tax dodgers, suddenly find themselves in an impossible bind. The judges fumble through hefty law tomes. They scour every statute for some magical clause on emergency cases of women commanding pirate vessels. But there is nothing, not a single line addressing what to do with a defendant capable of skewering you with a smile and a dagger. One judge rises, straightens his askew wig, more like a drunkard's cap, and asks with deadly seriousness, who incited her? Her husband? Some scoundrel? Or Satan himself? Clearly, the notion that a woman might choose to become a pirate seems more absurd than talking waves. Witnesses file in, mostly sailors who look as though they've been beaten by the defendant, and indeed they have. They recount how she plunged into battle without hesitation, her blade flashing, her commands cutting sharper than a monsoon wind. One captain, trembling as he speaks, swears that she not only led men into combat, but swore more coherently than any man aboard. The gallery, half in awe, half in fear, whispers, "Perhaps she ought to be admiral." The problem is, the legal system has no mold for such a woman. Women, they insist, belong to needlework, to motherhood, or, at least, to everything but stealing ships. So, faced with this unprecedented scenario, the court resorts to delay. A clergyman is summoned to assess her moral waywardness. He clears his throat, delivers a marathon sermon on Eve, the forbidden fruit, and why women ought not leave the hearth, let alone the harbor. When he finishes, he seems convinced he's cured the plague, while the courtroom feels as though it survived 3 hours of compulsory catechism. Finally, they devise a temporary fix. Ask whether the defendant is pregnant. Astonishingly, this becomes the go-to legal loophole for female pirates. For by law, you cannot execute a woman carrying life within her, no matter if she's just stabbed 3 men and commandeered a warship. So she is sequestered to await childbirth, or, as it were, await the legal system's capitulation. Many of these women, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, vanish thereafter. No one knows if they gave birth, if they were pardoned, or if they slipped back to sea and resumed their plundering in the shadows. But one thing is certain. Each time they appeared before the court, the entire machinery ground to a halt and asked itself, "Are our laws really up to the task?" They were more than lawbreakers. They shattered every preconception of gender, of social order, and compelled the world to reconsider itself, even if only for a fleeting moment in that chalk-dusted courtroom amidst those puzzled gazes. You encounter Anne Bonny, not in a candlelit romance with whispered sweet nothings, but in a 1720 Jamaican courtroom, where sweat, gunpowder, and social prejudice mingle like the prevailing scent. That Irish woman needs no lengthy introduction. Her flaming red hair and dagger-sharp gaze say it all. And you know at once, she's not here to apologize for upending the world's order. When she's led before the bench, the room seems poised for contrition. But no, you witness Anne standing tall, chin lifted, as if watching a tedious play she's memorized. No sobs, no excuses, only ironic silence that you feel in every heartbeat. For Anne does not tremble. It is the judges who lose their composure. Then comes the fateful moment. You hear the sentence pronounced, death. The courtroom holds its breath, awaiting her reaction. A collapse, a plea, at least a furrowed brow. But Anne? She merely smiles, a slight wry smile, neither venomous nor mocking, but as if bored by a performance grown stale. And then she fixes her steady gaze on the judge. You sense the space shrink, as though the very air leans toward her. In a calm voice that sends chills down your spine, she delivers, "If he'd fought like a man, he wouldn't have died like a dog." You can hardly believe your ears. Her words explode through the chamber like a cannon shot, not for volume, but for the brutal truth they bear. The man she referenced was a comrade, once hailed as a brother in arms, who fell in their latest skirmish. And in Anne's eyes, that death was not tragedy, but folly. Silence grips the bench. You see a judge's hand shake, dropping his quill. A clergyman murmurs disapprovingly, as if warding off evil. But Anne remains unmoved. She does not blink. And you know, this is no mere retort. It is a proclamation. With that line, she claims the right to rage, the right to fight, and shatters every ingrained assumption about gender in crime. You see it in the men's eyes around you, bewilderment, not because she is a pirate, but because she is a woman daring to speak, and speaking with reason. Anne needs no weapon in that courtroom. She wields her wit, her words, and a contempt so profound it forces the entire justice system, accustomed to the meek, onto the defensive. You feel it, and begin to understand why history remembers her name, while so many others have swung into oblivion. Then, as if icing on an already audacious cake, Anne drops her final bombshell. You hear it clearly. She is pregnant. Suddenly, the execution is stayed. Not for mercy, but because the law forbade executing a woman carrying life within her. How ironic that life itself becomes the excuse for death to be halted. You watch Anne being led from the courtroom, hands still bound, head held high. She did not win that trial, at least not on paper. But in your eyes, in the eyes of many present that day, and in the pages of later history, she accomplished what no one else could. forced a system built by men to stand down. What happened afterward, you cannot say. Rumor has it she escaped, that she was quietly released, or that she lived on in anonymity under another name. But one thing you know for certain, Anne Bonny never bowed her head. She was no skirt-wearing pirate behind a man's shadow. She was a storm in breeches, daring every boundary. And in that sweltering, prejudice-laden courtroom, you no longer saw her as a criminal. You saw a woman who dared to be herself, despite the age, despite the price. And you smile quietly, realizing, if one must face execution merely for being different, Anne Bonny would do so, with style. You're still watching that historic trial, where Anne Bonny, the red-haired, fearless woman, stands face to face with death without so much as a blink. Everyone in the courtroom was certain it was over. The female pirate holds her head high. Her eyes betray no remorse. The death sentence hangs like an unwelcome coat hook nobody dares mention. But then, just when all think the show is about to end, Anne plays her unexpected trump card. Not a dagger hidden in her sleeve, but a simple phrase, light as air, yet heavier than the thick law book the judge clings to. I'm pregnant. You can hear the silence drop into the room, not the solemn hush of justice, but the awkward quiet when someone arrives at a dinner party without trousers. The judge clears his throat, scans the room for a legal clerk, who instantly pretends to be hunched over documents, though he holds his quill upside down. A few men in the gallery flush. Others avert each other's gaze. A female pirate. Pregnant? That's not in the script. But this isn't a novel stunt. Under 18th century English law, and remember, this is an era when statutes were penned by powdered-wigged gentlemen who deemed women prone to hysteria at every full moon, there's a very clear clause. A pregnant woman cannot be executed. Not out of mercy, but because the paperwork for killing someone who isn't yet born is too convoluted. The legal machinery of the day, so adept at sentencing, balks at overtime for fetuses. Anne knows this, and you realize this is no desperate gambit. It's a savvy, subtle, and utterly lawful counterattack. She sheds no tears, utters no pleas, makes no appeals to faith or repentance. She needs only 5 words. I am with child. Enough to halt the entire system as though a carriage wheel had snagged her skirt. Now you might wonder, was Anne truly pregnant? That's a question no one dared voice aloud, because verifying it would require a female physician as rare as ice in Jamaica, or a confession from Anne, rarer even than a swimming cat. And since nobody wanted to linger on the subject longer than necessary, the court opts for the simplest solution: stay the execution. You can almost see the satisfaction flicker in Anne's eyes, not the triumph of one spared death, but the faint curl of lips belonging to someone who's just won a game of intellectual chess. For in a world where men decree that women should be silent and so, she used their own laws against them, and prevailed. The court, so formidable in condemnation, is utterly powerless when compelled to wait. No one knows what to do with a prisoner who cannot be hanged for months, yet cannot be freed. They detain her under observation, a polite way of hoping her belly provides the answer. But time passes. Nothing happens. No baby, no symptoms, no medical confirmation, and certainly no admission from Anne. Only her proud silence, as though she's saying, "I never lied. You never bothered to check." You witnessed the chaos among the authorities, an indefinitely postponed sentence, a defendant outwitting her judges, and a law artfully exploited to the point no one dares amend it. In the end, they keep her in prison for a while, perhaps awaiting truth, perhaps awaiting a political compromise, or simply hoping she fades from the record. And indeed, like ink dried by the wind, Anne Bonny gradually vanishes from official documentation. No one is certain what happened afterward. Some rumors say she escaped. Others claim she was quietly released on condition she never returned to Caribbean waters. But whatever the outcome, one thing is certain. She was never executed. No gallows ever claimed her. In an age when women were deemed weak and inconsequential, Anne Bonny, with a single phrase, a cunning ploy, and a belly, perhaps real, perhaps not, brought the entire system to its knees in waiting. And if you still doubt that intellect can trump violence, recall her gaze in that moment, icy, intelligent, utterly in control. You see, the sharpest blade isn't always steel. Sometimes, the right words at the right time and a womb full of cunning are enough to turn the tide of history. After stepping down from the gallows as if from a slightly tense stroll, Anne Bonny vanished from the records like ink washed away by rain. No obituary, no explanatory minutes. No one saw her board a ship again, and no one dared be sure she ever left prison. Yet, like any historical figure too compelling to be forgotten, she didn't vanish entirely. She was replaced by rumor. You'll hear every version imaginable. One claims her father, a merchant furious that his daughter ran off with a pirate, secretly ransomed her by greasing the palms of Jamaican officials. Perhaps he decided it was cheaper to buy her freedom than to endure the town calling her his daughter for decades. Others believe she was sent to a remote village, lived out her days as an old fishwife, still wearing trousers, still smoking a pipe, still calling everyone kid, even if they were 2 years her senior. Then you'll catch the tale from an old sailor who swore he met Anne in New Orleans in 1743. According to him, she moved with the same sharp agility, her gaze razor bright, as though ready to draw steel at any moment, still daring anyone to ask, "Are you?" before changing the subject. Though no portrait or self-portrait exists, selfies being centuries away, you must admit there's something unmistakably Anne Bonny in those stories. And the law? Did they come searching? Likely not. Not because they'd forgiven her, but because they were baffled. How do you deal with a woman who escaped execution with a single phrase, and then disappeared? No manual covers this. So, like every thorny problem people prefer to leave untouched, the authorities let it lie. Perhaps they felt relieved by her absence rather than defeated. In the pirate world, a hanging is considered the end of one's career, a forced retirement, if you will. But for Anne, survival, and survival that lingered, became a rare honor. She slipped through the trial, exploited a legal loophole, and evaded the memory of the magistrates, crafting a legend that needed no stone engraving. In pirate lore, she didn't merely survive. She retired like a CEO, leaving the chaos for her subordinates to sort out. And you, if you ponder this, will realize Anne didn't just break the rules. She rewrote them. In a society where women couldn't command a ship, she captained one. Where women were expected to be silent, she stood before a court as though addressing a tavern full of listeners. And in a world that revered the letter of the law, she tangles it like wet rope. She needed no book. She lived as a new guidebook for any woman daring to chart her own course. You might ask, was she happy? Who knows? Perhaps she tended a small farm with a herd of goats, or piloted a flatboat laden with salt down the Mississippi. Maybe she returned to her old trade, plundering quietly, wisely, under an alias. Whatever her fate, you sense she kept that same piercing gaze, the one capable of shredding the world's pretense, and that phrase ever at the ready. If you fought like real men, I wouldn't need to speak. So in the end, Anne Bonny exited history not with a judge's gavel, but with a question mark suspended in midair. Not hanged, not sealed by a final indictment, not buried beneath a tombstone for eulogies or moral lessons. Instead, she left behind whispered tales passed down through generations, each retelling adding a scar, a pistol, or a secret wink. But always her, the woman who froze the entire justice system in its tracks. And if you're curled up in bed, wondering why this story keeps you awake rather than lulling you to sleep, perhaps it's because it never truly ends. Anne Bonny, or at least her spirit, still rides among those who refuse the scripted path, those who say no when told to be silent. And somewhere out there, she watches you, her gaze equal parts wry and challenging. Do you dare rewrite the rules of your own game? In the dimly lit room, as you slowly nestle under your familiar blanket, let me share a tale that is neither loud nor glorious, yet haunting in its own way. The story of Mary Read, a woman so formidable that the world mistook her for a man until it was too late to correct its error. Mary did not come to the sea as a sun-struck tourist. She came because life on land was too confining. Born into a family of modest means, her mother disguised her as a boy from infancy to continue receiving her late husband's pension. And when you live as a boy for long enough, you begin to question why you must inhabit someone else's role. Raised as a soldier under a male guise, Mary fought like any true warrior, and not the decorative kind that merely stands at the castle gate. She actually wielded a sword, scaled walls, and struck down foes as if greeting the dawn. Yet life's script soon flipped. She left the army, boarded a ship, and became a pirate. Yes, from disciplined soldier to outlaw of the waves, with nothing but a fair wind changing her course. At sea, Mary Read needed no pretense. When you plunder vessels, people care far more about the speed and precision of your blade than whether you wear a skirt or breeches. Comrades admitted one thing. Mary did more than match the men. She outshone many of them. No one saw her falter. No one heard her complain. And any who dared mock her usually had no chance to repeat their jibes, having found themselves flat on the deck. Then in 1720, fate, or perhaps some errant cannon fire, placed Mary beside Anne Bonny on the same captured ship. They were marched to Jamaica, tried, and sentenced to hang. No grand build-up, no dramatic pause. Justice, it seemed, was scribbled on a scrap of paper, and the end was immediate. But Mary, like Anne, refused to be subdued by a rope. She knew the law. Pregnant women could not be executed. And so, in a moment both desperate and cunning, she declared she was with child. No tearful performance, no oaths of faith or repentance, just a simple statement that threw the courtroom, full of dignified, powdered-wigged gentlemen accustomed to surprises, into utter disarray. Once again, the court stayed the sentence. Mary earned an indefinite reprieve, at least until her condition could be confirmed. Yet unlike her partner who stepped away from death and vanished like sea mist, Mary never received a second chapter. In the dank prison, amidst moldy stone walls and thick, fetid air, Mary Read, the woman who had fought at sea and outwitted the law with a clever belly, succumbed not to steel, but to illness. No soldiers came to liberate her. No ship whisked her away. No daring escape haunts the chronicles. Only her quiet passing within the heavy stone confines of the Jamaican jail, her final moments left unrecorded. Picture that scene. A woman who lived as a warrior, now lying without an audience, without fanfare, with no tombstone to bear her name. Every record ends with a stark line. Mary Read died in prison, 1721. And no one knows whether she truly bore a child. No medical report, no confirmation, only a silent question mark echoing her departure. And as you lie there, in the stillness of your room, you may wonder, why must someone so bold, so indomitable, leave the world in such painfully ordinary silence? The answer likely isn't written in history's pages. History, you know, loves battles, revolts, reversals. It adores the dramatic. But sometimes, what makes us pause is not a roar, but a hush, because that silence can be the fiercest note of all. Mary Read has no statue, no street bears her name. Yet, in every whispered retelling, she lives on, not for the battles she won, but for daring to chart a life like no other. She never asked permission to be different. She simply did what needed doing, and let the world adjust around her. So tonight, when you close your eyes, remember Mary Read, not as a legendary pirate, but as a woman who refused to live by anyone else's rules. And even if her end was not glorious, it stands as a gentle reminder. Sometimes, the bravest act is simply to live true to yourself, no matter how it ends. Now, you leave behind the gunpowder smoke of the Caribbean and sail eastward, landing in early 19th century China, not to admire temples or study calligraphy, but to meet a woman who could make 3 empires tremble without firing a single cannon. Her name is Qing Shi, and if that name is new to you, rest assured, it seems the authorities of Qing China, Portugal, and Britain alike wish they could have forgotten it forever. You don't encounter her on a throne, but on a ship's deck. Not a lone vessel, but an entire fleet. Over 300 warships, organized like a joint stock company at sea, with Qing Shi as its absolute CEO. She didn't lead a band of pirates. She ran a floating empire. And if you picture a bearded man bellowing orders, think again. It was a slender woman, her gaze ice cold, utterly unconcerned with dissent. Before she became the undisputed pirate sovereign, Qingxi served aboard a pleasure junk, where wealthy gentlemen went to momentarily forget their wives. But Qingxi played no part in illusion. She married Zheng Yi, the fleet's then commander, not with mere beauty, but by contract, demanding a share of authority. In other words, she turned marriage into a strategic merger. And when Zheng Yi died suddenly, by storm, not by mutiny, let us believe it so, Qingxi not only inherited the fleet, but made it more formidable. Picture her seated among scores of male captains, long accustomed to commanding by fist. Yet before her, they bowed to hear policy announcements. She enacted her own code, strict sometimes, literal to a fault. A pirate who raped a civilian? Off with the head. A pirate who plundered for personal gain? Ear cut, then head severed. You needn't Google to know that under Qingxi, discipline outranked plunder. As her armada swelled, the Qing Navy panicked. They dispatched warships to deal with her. You'd think the imperial treasury would solve the problem by sunrise. Yet they failed. Then they called in reinforcements, the Portuguese and the British, two naval greats. The result? Another string of defeats. Apparently, no naval academy offered how to face a brilliant woman leading 70,000 pirates. Finally, when Qingxi had mastered all the sea lanes, she did the unthinkable. She retired. But not like a market vendor or a tea-house proprietor. No, she strode into the Guangdong governor's office, flanked by just enough attendants to have the gate thrown open without question. There you witness one of history's greatest criminal negotiations. No bullets fired. Qingxi demanded full amnesty for herself and every pirate in her coalition, retention of all booty, and, astonishingly, no past crimes prosecuted. If that sounds delusional, you've never faced a woman who bested 3 naval superpowers. And they agreed. Picture the governor, sweat beading on his brow, nodding at each term, while Qingxi, perhaps sipping jasmine tea, smiles as though closing on a property deal. No swords, no threats, only logic, a waiting pirate fleet, and a reputation that left any sane person with no choice but to concede. Afterward, she settled in Guangzhou, opening a casino and a brothel. Yes, you heard correctly, because after running an outlaw empire for years, operating a legal enterprise felt like a vacation. Imagine her, lounging in an armchair, tea in hand, watching patrons come and go with a lazy yet penetrating gaze. A former pursuer crosses the threshold. She doesn't even glance up from her chess game. All surviving records show she lived long, she lived well, and she outlived every enemy, retiring before them all. No final battle, no cinematic climax, just the peculiar peace of someone who'd won every hand, even when no one thought she belonged at the table. You've just let your mind drift past sails and cannon smoke. Now lean back and surf the waves of legal cunning, the deadliest weapon ever wielded by female pirates, the beg-for-your-belly tactic. Yes, you heard correctly. Not a dagger, not a flintlock pistol, but the womb, or at least pretending one is in play. Under 18th century English law, A woman sentenced to death could not be executed if she was pregnant, because even the sternest judges felt awkward signing orders to hang two people at once, especially when one hadn't yet drawn breath. So the law mandated a stay of execution to protect the innocent life, even if the mother was an international criminal. But you're wondering, how did they verify it? A pregnancy test? An ultrasound probe? Alas, no. They relied on what they called the matron jury, a panel of older women, often the wives of officials, midwives, or anyone who'd ever heard of pregnancy in her life. These matrons were summoned, ushered into the cell, and conducted a hands-on assessment. Picture it. The pirate sits there, arms crossed, glaring. A group of 5 to 7 matrons, their white caps like muffin tops, enter with solemn faces, as if grading final exams. They ask questions like, "Do you feel nauseous? When was your last period?" Or, "Do you feel the baby kick?" Of course, none of these questions yield instant proof, nor is there medical documentation to compare. This is the moment acting skills reign supreme. A well-timed burp, a hand pressed convincingly to the abdomen, or, in standout cases, a few cloth inserts artfully tucked beneath the skirt. That was often enough to give the legal machine pause. See, in an era when men believed they controlled everything, a sudden pregnant belly forced them into an emergency meeting, unsure whether to summon a physician or a clergyman. The matrons, naturally, weren't always fooled, but consider their plight. You're a 60-year-old matron, roused from bed at midnight to inspect the belly of a woman who plundered a ship 3 days ago. You'd likely err on the side of caution, rather than risk hanging a bona fide expectant mother. The dread of gossip about executing a pregnant woman by mistake was enough to make even the strictest matron look the other way. And so, the court was compelled to delay. The death sentence shelved. No set date. It remained until childbirth, a vague yet legally valid postponement. The only problem? That baby sometimes never arrived. And administrative urgency then moved slower than a turtle uphill, so a few months' delay could stretch into a year, ample time for the pirate to hatch a new plan, or for history to forget the affair entirely. You can picture the judge scribbling in his docket, hand trembling. Defendant claims pregnancy, summon matron jury, stay execution, reason, potential infant. Meanwhile, the defendant lounges behind bars, legs crossed, sipping pretend tea, secretly counting the days until her escape. Some cases succeeded so completely that no record of their trial's end was ever found. Some remained pregnant for 14 months. Others could not give birth due to psychological shock. A few mysteriously miscarried, then were released on grounds of ill health. And once freed, they vanished as if they'd never existed, so that feigning pregnancy not only spared them from death, but opened a portal of instantaneous disappearance from history. Of course, not everyone escaped. There were instances when the claim failed to persuade, or the matron jury happened to convene on an unusually clear-headed morning, and they said no. But in most cases, a dash of creativity, a flicker of expression, and a flexible belly were enough to freeze an empire's legal apparatus in its tracks. You begin to see the irony, don't you? In a world that deemed women weak, barred them from battlefields, from parliaments, even from learning to read, female pirates turned that very prejudice into their weapon. I am with child, not a plea for mercy, but a tactic, not to beg compassion, but to seize control of the moment. And once you dictate the timing of your trial, you nearly command your own destiny. So, when you hear names like Anne Bonny, Mary Read, or the countless other female pirates absent from textbooks, remember this. They didn't just seize ships, they seized time, and wrested initiative from those who believed the law was immutable. Who would have guessed that, with nothing more than a belly and a perfectly timed smirk, they could steer history itself to their will? When captured, a female pirate wasn't escorted to sunlit cells with sea view windows and 3 o'clock tea. No. She was often stuffed into places where even the rats were considering relocation. Cracked old forts, damp cellars beneath administrative headquarters, or forgotten warehouses behind the men's prison, so long as they were sealed tight enough to muffle screams and remote enough that nobody bothered delivering meals on time. You can picture it. Once she stood on deck, hair tangled by sea wind, issuing crisp orders to 100 sailors. Now she huddles on cold stone floors, back against a moss-slick wall, listening to each drop of water plinking from the ceiling as if it were a countdown to oblivion. Prison isn't a play with a final curtain. It's a stage whose lights never come back on. Some female pirates, either too notorious or deemed too beautiful by their rough-neck jailers, were even turned into ticketed attractions. Yes, you heard that right. Locals, instead of heading to the market for fish, would flock to see the pirate woman. They'd press their faces against the bars, gawking like visitors at a strange beast in a cage. Some jeered, some spat. Others tossed coins to reward the silent spectacle. And many wardens treated it as a side hustle. And the pirate? At first, she might have spat on an officer's polished boots, or snarled a warning to gouge out any gawker's eyes. But time is a ruthless weapon. After weeks, months, when her spine ached from the cold wind seeping through stone cracks, when the clomp of the guard's boots became the only sound she heard each day, even the woman who once felled 5 men with a single dagger would feel something all too familiar: hollow silence. Imagine one morning, a sliver of light filtering through a narrow iron grate, and she sits there, knees drawn to her chest, eyes distant as she recalls some lost raid. No ropes, no compass, no black flag snapping in the breeze. Only the echo of waves, not the real roar, but the reverberation in her mind. Waves crashing against a ship's hull, the laughter of comrades, the howl of rigging in a storm. Now all that remains inside her head, looping like an old song she can no longer conduct. In that era, you couldn't request medical care, especially not if you were a criminal, and even more so if you were a woman. Fevers, infections, coughing up blood. These were not reasons to summon a doctor, but merely prompts to draft a death notice. Some died of simple colds. illnesses they once laughed off while sailing through storms. But within those thick stone walls, in air heavy as damp cotton, the human body quickly forgot how to fight back. The cruelest truth was not death itself, but how the outside world kept turning. Ships still sailed, waves still crashed ashore. Taverns remained open, trading tales of the once famous women pirates, while those women themselves faded into obscurity in a dark corner, forgotten. No more trials, no letters to loved ones, no cinematic finales, only silence. And occasionally, the winds whistle through a rusty grate, sounding like mocking laughter from a world that had turned its back. There were days she listened to footsteps in the corridor, not in hope of release, but merely to know someone still lived beyond those walls. Sometimes a young guard would fling a tray of food at her without a glance. She would regard the stale biscuit as if it were a treasure map, not because it was tasty, but because it was the only reminder that today was not her last waking moment. Think on that. A woman who once commanded 100 sailors, who negotiated with governors, who threatened to send the British fleet's captains scurrying back to port, now powerless against malaria. She no longer gave orders. She no longer resisted. Yet she did not beg for mercy. For some, silence is not surrender. It is the last refuge of their pride. Perhaps on the day she died, no one noticed. No bell tolled, no mourner came. Only the jailer inscribed in his ledger, "Female prisoner died of illness." But you know better. She was not merely a prisoner. She was a storm once named. And sometimes storms do not dissipate. They are simply confined within their own memory. In a world where the law was exhausted from chasing women wielding swords and shouting on deck, the authorities, after countless meetings with charts, red ink, and many sighs, hit upon a humane yet effective solution. Marry them off. Yes, marriage. Not a sentence, not a rope, but wedding gowns, cake, and a husband patient, or naive, enough to believe a ring could replace iron shackles. Think it a joke? Far from it. There were courts that ruled, acquitted, provided you wed a respectable man. Respectable, defined vaguely. He must wear a hat, not carry a knife, and know how to avoid being boarded at noon. Beyond that, the regime believed wifely duties would cure any criminal tendencies. Picture the pirate in the dock, brow furrowed as the judge suggests. Instead of hanging, she need only marry a man of moral standing. You can see her expression in that instant. Not panic, not gratitude, but the look of someone who once fired cannons at merchant vessels, now forced to consider if her counterpart truly believes she'll stay home. Darning socks. Yet she nods. And so the wedding proceeds, perhaps in the prison courtyard, perhaps before the justice official, or, in a cost-saving move, right in the interrogation room. No fresh flowers, no live music, only a ring and a tacit vow. If you kill your husband, there'll be no second chance. The tale reads like a twisted fairy tale. Then marriage begins, or what society called marriage. She's sent home, handed a kitchen and a needle. What those optimistic men failed to grasp was, if she could helm a warship through a storm, overseeing a kitchen would seem child's play. Some pirates quietly vanish from history after their weddings. Rumor says they reformed. Perhaps. But other accounts whisper that they continued life as they wished, only now with cunning. Instead of shouting orders, they whispered strategies. The dagger no longer hung at the waist, but lay hidden in a drawer beside the soup pot. A few even named their children after lost ships or vessels they once commanded. When asked, why Black Marauder, they'd simply smile. It sounded fitting, didn't it? And the husbands? Some lived in blissful ignorance, convinced they'd rehabilitated a wayward woman. They'd host dinner parties, boasting that their former pirate wife now made excellent stews. Meanwhile, she'd secretly pen memoirs in black ink on the back of the menu. On certain nights, as he slept soundly, she'd sit by the window, moonlight glinting on her water basin. Her thoughts not on tomorrow's soup, but on tides, charts, and the roars of long-ago raids. Marriage could tether her feet to the kitchen, but never her spirit to dry land. Some, after a time, disappeared from town. Some with husband and child, others alone. Locals said they'd moved away. The curious speculated they'd boarded ship once more, never to return. Perhaps true, for one who has tasted freedom finds it hard to dwell forever in a parlor of lace curtains and mismatched tea sets. Viewed through history's lens, using marriage to contain criminal women was a clever way to mask legal impotence. The law didn't know how to handle a woman too bold, too sharp, too dangerous. So it thought a husband could replace the entire justice system. A wedding ring, simple, shiny, and, in the authorities' eyes, more effective than handcuffs. But here's the truth. Those who once defied entire fleets and shouted down judges are not easily tamed. They merely learned to bide their time. The wedding dress was no end. It was a new disguise. And in that kitchen, you might see a woman slicing onions. But look closely, and you'll notice her blade hand still remembers every piratical rhythm. Only now, she chooses finer cuts. Perhaps one evening, as the family dines, she pauses to look at her husband and softly asks, "If you were robbed at sea, what would you do?" He laughs, uninterested, replies, "I'd negotiate." And in her mind drifts a single sigh. How quaint. There you have it. Marriage, the authorities' grand legal tool, was meant to heal adventurous souls. Yet for female pirates, it proved merely the next chapter, not because they changed, but because they were too clever to stop living, without roaring on deck. In the 18th century, when the internet was the stuff of sorcerers' dreams, and the swiftest message rode on a pigeon with a strong motor, print newspapers reigned supreme. And you know how the press works. Nothing sold like scandal, and no figure ignited frenzy like a female pirate. A woman bold enough to seize ships, to bear arms, to shout down Royal Navy captains, and, good heavens, wear trousers instead of skirts. For reporters then, this wasn't mere news. This was the jackpot. The moment a woman pirate was captured at sea, you could bet that by dawn the harbor's newsstands would be sold out. Headlines in bold type, sensational enough to shame today's tabloids. Red-haired she-devil rides the waves of terror, or axe-wielding Amazon in petticoats terrifies villagers. Such headlines weren't about informing, they were about selling, and female pirates, regardless of name, instantly became the pop culture icons of the 18th century without a single PR manager. Imagine crowds gathering before the courthouse, not out of concern for justice, but eager to see for themselves the one who dared upend all order. They didn't need to understand the law. They just needed to see a woman, often lean, sun-baked, eyes like daggers, led in with bound hands and an expression of, "I'm still not convinced." To them, it was a traveling circus, the trial a stage play, and the leading lady, though wordless, compelled them to pay top price for the best seats. The irony was that this very fame sometimes became a shield. Think a caught-at-sea woman pirate would face immediate hanging? Not always. When the public became infatuated, writing letters, debating her fate, sketching her likeness on tankards, the authorities began to hesitate, not out of mercy, but out of fear of backlash. After all, no one wished to be remembered as the one who hanged the most sensational woman of the year. Thus, verdicts were stayed. Officials fumbled through dossiers in conference rooms, flipping pages, wondering, are we executing a criminal or extinguishing a media phenomenon? Some softened charges. Instead of treason, they called it conduct unbecoming of one's sex. Gentler words, yet the reality remained: iron shackles and dank cells. Yet fame is a double-edged sword. Just as today's careless headline can ruin a career, then a recklessly lurid blurb could transform a heroine into a social menace. Female pirate assaults male sailor. No verification needed, simply print and distribute. One day, she's the brave woman challenging the Royal Navy. The next, she's a threat to public morality. And just like that, public opinion turned on a dime. Reporters cared little for nuance. To them, more readers equaled better sales, regardless if that meant recasting the victim as villain or dubbing her the Northern Widow of Blood. You read the moniker and wonder, who approved this copy? But don't be surprised. It may well have been the very editor who campaigned against women's education. The laughable, or tragic, truth is that the public knew it all was exaggerated. They understood the real story lay somewhere between the column inches and the foaming tankard in their hand. Yet they read on. They gossiped. They jeered. For humanity, even in the 18th century, couldn't resist the extraordinary. And what was more extraordinary than a woman living on her own terms? Sometimes, when a female pirate ascended the gallows, there were tears, not from kin, but from fans. Some clandestinely brought flowers, laying them at the prison gate as if mourning a rock star's canceled tour. And in their eyes, there may not have been pure respect, but there was certainly admiration. For in a society built on constraint, one woman dared to stand and shout, "No!" So, as you lie there curled beneath your blanket, realize this. Those old newspapers didn't just chronicle female pirates. They unwittingly painted the clearest portrait of their own society, craving the extraordinary, yet recoiling when it appeared. And in that whirlwind, women were puppeteered, heroes one moment, monsters the next, all at the mercy of a misprinted headline. funny, isn't it? A world that hailed these women as proto-feminist icons also quietly sharpened the noose. A two-faced game where audiences adored the very souls they helped confine. Yet perhaps that is why these pirates remain immortal. They were never fully understood, and they are never fully forgotten. In every tale you've heard of Anne Bonny riding the waves as casually as a stroll down the lane, or of Ching Shi negotiating with authorities as if choosing from a dim sum menu, there's always something that glitters, a halo, an emblematic status. But you know, that glow only lights a few. The rest are gently nudged aside by history, into a dark corner with no spotlight, no citations, and certainly no monuments. Alongside those celebrated names, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of other women pirates who once wielded swords, climbed the rigging, and shouted defiantly through storms, then vanished from every chronicle as if they'd never existed. No names carved on stone, no oil-painted portraits, no mention in sixth-grade history books. Yet they were there. Imagine them. Tavern barmaids, pouring ale for drunk sailors, who one day grew weary of polishing mugs and hearing tales they thought, I could do that. So they shrugged off their aprons, nicked a kitchen knife, and climbed aboard the first vessel in need of hands. No farewell, no slow-motion scene, just firm footsteps and a choice that needed no applause. There were sailor wives, too, who once waved goodbye to husbands setting sail. After years of receiving more death notices than love letters, they decided, if the sea had taken everything, they'd better go claim it back. Not for vengeance, but because they refused to believe waiting at home was their only calling. And there were the accidental adventurers, girls who tagged along to the docks to hawk baskets of fish, only to find themselves selling their souls to the ocean breeze. They had no plan, no strategy, no ambition to rule any waters. They had only one thing: no fear. And sometimes that was enough to become a pirate. You wonder why they're not remembered? Simple. They didn't fit. Not the law. They were used to that. But the imagination of history's scribes. A woman brandishing a sword, shouting commands amid rough men, and refusing a skirt. It threw those goose-quill historians into chaos. They could write of kings, of generals, even of romantic bearded buccaneers. But a woman acting on her own terms? As if she needed no saving? Sorry, no room in this year's edition. So they were cut out, not by sword, but by silence. Quietly, swiftly, efficiently. An untold story is a person unmade, at least in the eyes of posterity. Yet you know, silence can echo louder than drums. Their absence poses a question mark, hovering between two timelines. If they were unimportant, why so determined to erase them? Those women needed no fanfare. They lived, fought, and vanished like brief waves. No clamor, no demand for credit. But consider, what holds a ship at sea? The silent currents below, not the howling gales above. They were those currents, propelling an era forward, yet forgotten by name. Perhaps they preferred it that way. No forced symbolism, no moral lessons imposed. Simply human, flawed, fierce, and real in ways you'll never read in a romantic poem. They may have fallen, been captured, sat in cells. But one thing's certain, they chose. And you know, choice was a rare privilege for 18th century women. To leave home, to take to the sea, to seize a ship, to refuse the scripted life. Even if only for a single day, that day deserved engraving in stone. But history doesn't use stone. It uses ink. And ink, sadly, flows where those who control the pen wish it to go. So when you hear celebrated names, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, Ching Shi, remember they did not stand alone. They were merely the tip of an iceberg made of women who dared defy it all, the law, the prejudices, even oblivion. And if you listen closely, in tonight's steady ocean lullaby, you might hear a faint voice whisper, "I was there too, but I never needed someone to write my story." You journey to ancient Sumer, not to admire stone statues or learn cuneiform, but to discover why the contents of your fridge were once the national currency. Yes, beer. But don't picture a golden pint in a glass embossed with a logo. Sumerian beer was cloudy as rice water, thick as gruel, and regarded as a sacred gift from the gods. No joke. The Sumerians believed the goddess Ninkasi herself taught them brewing, and when a beverage has its own patron deity, you know it's serious. Beer wasn't just a comfort drink, it was sustenance. A temple builder's daily wage was paid in beer, not in sips, but in liters. Records show each laborer received up to 5 liters per day. If you're thinking, how could anyone work after that much drinking? Remember, Sumerian beer was low in alcohol and oatmeal thick. In effect, they were downing a liquid lunch, and they drank constantly. Morning drafts before sunrise, a mid-shift swig, another sip after setting each brick. Beer flowed like the Tigris, and no one questioned why. Today, you'd be reprimanded for nursing a pint at 9 a.m. In Sumer, that was working to standard. In Egypt, beer held equal reverence. Beyond quenching thirst under the sun, it supplied strength to pyramid builders. When you see those ton-weight stones dragged by hand, ask yourself, what fueled them? The answer is simple: beer and bread, often indistinguishable from one another. Even mythology credits beer with saving humanity. In one tale, the sun god Ra, enraged by mankind's insolence, sent Sekhmet, the lioness-headed warrior goddess, to slaughter humans. Sekhmet took her task too seriously. Rivers of blood flowed until the other gods despaired. Their plan? Brew beer mixed with sedatives and dyed red, or so the myth goes, flooded across the plains, and Sekhmet, mistaking the brew for blood, drank deeply, fell into stupor, and forgot her mission. Humanity was spared, thanks to beer. So next time you raise a glass, remember, that drink once prevented human extinction. A contribution worthy of praise, if slightly inebriating. Even more fascinating, in antiquity, women held the brewing secrets. They were the master brewers, testing quality, running the microbrewery, aka the household hearth. No marketing, no labels. Yet, they built brands. Some women were so famed that their names were etched on stone beer vessels, alongside recipes kept as jealously as a modern Coca-Cola formula. They brewed not only for families, but for festivals, temples, and rituals. A major event without beer signified impending doom. Beer was offered to gods, traded as currency, stored in sealed clay jars as carefully as diamonds. And the drinking method? No tin cans or glass stouts. Instead, communal jars from which many sipped via long reeds, like team bubble tea, only brewer. Sharing straws wasn't unhygienic, but a sign of fellowship. Drinking together forged bonds, akin to sworn brotherhood or a pact to build a temple with bare hands. And here's the funniest part. The modern symbol of masculinity, bars, football, icy pints, originated in women's kitchens, where they did more than cook. They cooked up history. While men argued over haze and hop profiles, their foremothers solved that millennia earlier, adding herbs, dried fruit, and a pinch of magic to each brew. Picture a pre-dawn Sumerian woman seated beside a roaring barley mash, stirring with devotion, softly invoking Ninkasi's blessing on today's batch. This was no mere chore. It was ritual, a communion of earth, hunger, and faith. A mug of viscous, grain-scented beer wasn't just breakfast. It was a living covenant between humanity and nature, labor and reward, mortals and divinity. And sometimes, it even swayed the gods to mercy. So, when you lift your glass, amidst a crowded bar or alone in your kitchen, spare a thought for those ancient women, uncredentialed brewers with no foodie magazines, who nonetheless crafted the drink that sustained entire civilizations. And you know what? They did it all. No happy hour required. You step into an ancient Greek banquet, not the kind with amber lighting and lo-fi playlists, but rows of couches, flowing togas, and conversations that stretch until dawn. On the table lie intricately crafted clay cups, and at the center, wine. But don't imagine a dark red vintage poured from a clinking glass bottle. Back then, wine was syrupy and dense enough to double as mortar for building walls. So the Greeks had one very serious rule, and they were dead serious about seriousness. Wine had to be diluted. The ratio might be 1 part wine to 3 parts water, or more, depending on the depth of the discussion you plan to join. If you dared pour undiluted wine and drink like a TV ad for some vineyard, congratulations, you'd instantly be labeled uncivilized. Like shouting beer pong, anyone? In the National Library. To the Greeks, wine wasn't merely a beverage. It was a catalyst for philosophy. It prompted self-reflection, the gentle dismantling of a friend's argument, and just enough sobriety to maintain decorum. They called these gatherings symposiums, literally drinking together to speak of profound things, or at least to pretend profundity. And yes, if you ever doubted, Plato, Socrates, and the rest sat in symposiums, debating the shape of the soul while stirring their watered wine as gentlemanly as any modern cognac connoisseur. Cut to Rome, everything Greek, only more extreme, including the wine. The Romans inherited their Hellenic love of wine, then added aesthetic flair, ostentation, and a hefty dose of power. If you were a proper Roman citizen, wine in the house was mandatory. Lacking it was akin to going into battle without armor, uncivilized. They even bathed in wine for supple skin and a serene mood. Who first thought of bathing in wine remains unclear, but they were likely poor at pouring proportions. Roman wine wasn't reserved for intellectuals. It fueled festivals, banquets, and minor historical disasters. Recall Augustus, the emperor praised for wisdom and discipline? Legend has it he once overindulged at a feast and ordered the execution of a man simply for singing off-key. Whether he regretted it upon sobriety is unknown, but the singer never got to tell the tale. And then there's Nero. No lengthy introduction needed. The emperor remembered as an artistic reformer and perpetual villain. Nero's parties raged like an empire on the brink of collapse, which, in truth, was almost accurate. His feasts featured living torches, yes, people doused in oil and set ablaze, music from dawn till dusk, and wine flowing like a river. Each toast sent tremors through Rome's political machinery. Tales say, drunk, Nero believed himself Apollo incarnate and strummed a lyre in the forum. Whether the crowd applauded out of admiration or fear of execution remains debated. In Rome, wine was a double-edged sword. It elevated a banquet, greased political negotiations, and yet could plunge the entire court into chaos in one over-poured evening. Skilled statesmen learned to drink just enough to be amiable, but not enough to exclaim, "Now I shall speak my unvarnished truth." And you, lying under your blanket, might think, what can a glass of wine really do? But remember, in Greece, it could make you a philosopher. In Rome, a god, or the spark of a coup. Wine was more than a drink. It was a lifestyle, a tool, a trial, and the reason many awaken to wreckage and ask, "What did I say last night?" And if you believe that only happened then, perhaps you've never reopened a modern wine-fueled group chat. At least, you don't have to worry about your empire collapsing. One hopes. You step into a Viking hall, no amber lighting or lo-fi playlists here, but long benches, togas swaying, and roaring voices echoing beneath wooden rafters. The scent of roasted meat and fire mingles with the sweet, heady aroma of mead. But don't imagine breakfast honey. This fermented brew was sacred nectar, a special ticket to Valhalla, the warrior's paradise, and none wished to arrive empty-handed. In Norse myth, mead's source was a goat that produced alcohol rather than milk. Yes, you heard right. The goat's name was Heidrun, grazing on the roof of the god's hall, endlessly supplying mead for fallen warriors. Picture a goat farm, not for cheese, but for centuries of feasts. Each Viking, before battle, raised a horn of mead as farewell, or prearranged appointment, with Valhalla, and if he returned alive, he toasted again to boast of triumphs, embellish tales, and sometimes invent dragons. Every pour rewrote history for added drama. Beer didn't yield to mead. The Celts, spirited Western kin, turned revelry into a national sport. They didn't merely drink, but competed to drink, sang to drink, and told tales to drink. chroniclers note that dull storytellers were denied refills. A fair censorship, wouldn't you say? In these cultures, mead and beer were more than drinks. They bridged mortals and gods, rallied warriors' spirits, and numbed battlefield wounds, at least for hours. Nothing soothes psychological scars like strong drink and raucous laughter under a roaring hall. A Viking feast was like a wild football match with weapons and campfires. Everyone circled long tables, passing horns of mead. Glass was too fragile for armored hands. Each raised horn came with an oath, a poem, or a tale that might send someone tumbling from their bench with laughter. Yet these weren't lawless bacchanals. They had rules. The host, be he chieftain or honored hero, served as MC, bartender, and moral judge. Overindulge and break the hall? Punishment fell to the host's decree, perhaps cleaning the tables bare-handed, or worse, no more drink. A penalty harsher than exile for many. Amid song and clinking horns, the first pour was always offered to the fallen, a libation to welcome ancestral souls. Whether the ancestors truly came is unknown, but it kept them in the story, quite literally. The Celts believed shared drink-bound communities. Clink glasses with a stranger, and you'd not kill each other that night. A simple foreign policy with remarkable short-term effectiveness. Fairs, harvest festivals, and even markets had communal drinking corners, where conflicts were settled by who could drink fastest. By flickering torchlight, to harp strains and pounding drums, mead and beer flowed like streams. In those halls, all were equal, so long as you could down 3 horns and tell a tale without yawning. There, good memory, high tolerance, and storytelling flair were survival skills. 2 of 3 kept you safe. 1 still earned you a seat by the fire. When night fell, amid collective laughter and snoring, it was believed the gods had listened, not to solemn prayers, but to heartfelt toasts. In the Viking and Celtic world, a drink was not just to get drunk, but to be remembered, or to forget, and sometimes both. So as you lie beneath your blanket, nursing a cup of tea and listening to tales, remember, you inherit a millennia-old tradition. Only now, instead of horned cups and stone halls, you have a cozy bed and YouTube. Not bad, is it? You step into an ancient Chinese court banquet, not merely to drink at day's end, but to witness an art, a ritual, and occasionally a subtle test of social grace so exacting that a single mispour could cost you your official rank. In the palace, wine was served from elaborately carved bronze vessels, shaped like mythical beasts. Pouring was no casual affair. You tilted the vessel with solemn dignity, met your host's gaze, smiled just so, and under no circumstances let a drop spill, lest you soil your loyalty to the emperor. At literary gatherings, scholars played a game called wine orders. It sounds like a prohibition, yet in truth it was a sequence of cunning challenges. Participants had to compose poetry, drink wine, and maintain dignity before their peers. A single misstep in verse, or a wince after swallowing a sour sip, could be deemed a grave breach of etiquette. This was no jolly festivity. It was a battlefield where language was weapon and inebriation a test of intellect. But if you think Chinese wine was merely about loyalty and skill, cross the border to ancient India, where Soma was not a trendy juice brand, but a sacred potion extolled in the Rig Veda, one of the world's oldest scriptures. Soma was not only consumed, it was glorified in hymns of reverence, celebrated as the path to the divine. What was Soma made from? That remains one of history's most alluring mysteries. Some scholars argue it sprang from hallucinogenic mushrooms. Others believe it blended secret plants. Whatever the recipe, this holy drink was said to lift the spirit, expand the mind, and draw mortals closer to the cosmos. People did not merely drink soma for wakefulness. They drank to transcend their own limits. A single draught, according to legend, could allow one to hear the whispers of gods or see truth beyond the illusions of the mortal world. Imagine, on an ordinary morning, waking, sipping soma, and suddenly grasping life's meaning. Not bad for a beverage absent from your local convenience store. This stark contrast between two civilizations produced two approaches to wine and sacred drinks. In China, it was mastery. Drink, but never lose decorum. Drink to display status, virtue, and wisdom. In India, soma symbolized transcendence. Drink to break free from mundane cycles, to touch the divine. One side, courtly ceremony, the other, the soul of the universe. It's fascinating that, in both the Far East and South Asia, people found in wine and sacred brews something beyond mere pleasure. Tools to probe the human heart, gateways to insight, blends of joy and reverence. A small cup can hold a universe, if you know how to drink. Imagine yourself in ceremonial robes, seated in a Chinese temple courtyard, a dignitary tilting a bronze jug to fill your cup. Or picture yourself in an ancient Indian grove, echoing with chants, your hand wrapped around a bowl of fragrant soma. In that moment, you are not merely observing history, you are living it. And perhaps, like thousands of scholars over centuries, you'll wonder, can a single sip truly link mortals to gods? Or is it merely the most dignified excuse to become drunk? There's only one way to find out. Unfortunately, soma is not on your local bar menu. For now, close your eyes. Imagine the gentle clink of an ancient wine vessel, the waft of heady aromas, and the hush of a time-honored rite. Let your imagination ferment as lightly as aged wine. Who knows? Tonight's dream may seat you at the god's own feast. You travel to a strange realm where a meow is worth more than a prayer. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where cats were not merely pets, but VIPs, so revered that if you accidentally kicked one, you could be tried as a traitor. Here, cats embodied the goddess Bastet, personification of gentleness, protection, and perhaps a temper as fierce as the desert sun. But you know what's even more remarkable? The Egyptians didn't just adore cats, they mummified them. No joke. Cats were embalmed, adorned with amulets, and buried with care. You, however, if you died then, were unlikely to receive such honor. People even paraded cats as honored guests. Records tell us that if a house caught fire, Egyptians rescued the cat first. Valuables, furniture, even family members were secondary. Such exalted love, right? Don't wonder why cats remain aloof today. Your ancestors once worshipped them as deities, and they've never forgotten. Now shift the scene to ancient Rome, the city of empire, of gladiators, and jewelry-clad dogs. If you thought gold chains were only for modern rappers, you clearly never met a noble Roman's lapdog. These four-legged fluff balls donned solid gold collars, sometimes engraved with their names and family crests. Imagine, while slaves slogged barefoot sweeping the atrium, the pampered pooch enjoyed a pedicure. Justice, Roman style, was bittersweet. But Roman pets didn't stop at dogs. Romans kept parrots, no ordinary talkers, but Latin-speaking birds. Records suggest some parrots even memorized Cicero's verses, an achievement beyond many modern literature students. Some could greet guests, insult slaves, and perhaps comment on politics. Were they alive today, they might even run for office. And if you think only cats, dogs, and parrots received adoration, meet the little circus monkeys, the unpaid entertainers at elite banquets. Cloaked in tiny tunics, feathered caps perched jauntily, they danced like stage actors. Some were trained to serve drinks, though they often poured them over the nearest nobleman's head. A memorable spectacle, to be sure. Returning to Egypt, you'll scarcely believe the worship of cats. Records note that when a family cat died, the entire household mourned. Yes, the whole family shaved their brows, wept, and fasted for days. Who says only humans merit funerals? In Egypt, cats were kin. Kill one, even by accident, and an angry mob might stone you to death. No trial, no lawyer required. One misstep, and you were a national criminal. Herodotus, the Greek historian, recounts that a Persian soldier once took cats hostage during war, knowing Egyptians would not shoot arrows if cats stood before them. The tactic, using cats as shields, sounded absurd, yet it was devastatingly effective. You can scorn your enemy, but you would never harm a cat. If you find that extreme, fast forward to modern times, where people bake birthday cakes for dogs, hold weddings for cats, and live stream their fish tanks. Apparently, love for pets has changed little over millennia. Only the mummification has given way to Instagram. The Egyptians understood early that animals were more than companions. They were symbols, reminders of loyalty, guardianship, and occasionally, the judging stare when you're late feeding them. The Romans elevated that affection with gold bands, feather cushions, and even an entourage of animal dancers. Looking back, perhaps what makes the ancient world so fascinating isn't just pyramids, arenas, or mythic tales, but the way humans treated the smallest creatures: proud cats, bewildered dogs, loquacious parrots, and mischievous monkeys. In a world of wars and power struggles, sometimes the smallest acts of love for our pets make us endearingly human. In ancient China, where everything from eating rice to watching fish could become a form of meditation, you'd find goldfish gliding in porcelain bowls as if performing a ritual more tranquil than any chant. These bowls were not mere containers, but stages on which scaled performers curved and swayed in the soft dawn light. The Chinese believed that gazing at fish did more than calm the mind. It carried it beyond worldly cares. A goldfish's silent turn seemed to spin away every worry in its watery swirl. But goldfish were not the only cherished treasures. Did you know they also kept crickets? Yes, those tiny insects once deemed nuisances were raised in exquisitely crafted cages of bamboo, ivory, or even jade, not to jolt you awake like a morning alarm, but to savor their song as a mini symphony. Imagine a gentleman waking, opening a cage, listening to cricket choruses, and realizing his own life wasn't quite as bad as theirs. If that seems odd, journey onward to Mesoamerica, where dogs were not just companions, but spiritual guides. The Xoloitzcuintli, or Xolo for short, was a hairless hound whose wise eyes seemed to have read 1,000 Mayan tomes. The ancients believed that when humans died, their souls journeyed through the underworld, and only the Xolo could safely guide them. So if you thought dogs only barked for food, picture one donning goggles, clutching a map of the afterlife, and assuring you, "Relax, I've got this." Turn next to the jaguar, but not the Amazonian big cats you imagine. In Mesoamerican lore, jaguar cubs symbolized warriors, rulers, and the spirit world itself. On stone stelae and ceremonial masks, they roar with fearsome grace. A leader might lack a throne, but he would never be seen without a jaguar emblem, proving he was no weakling. And if you're still surprised, meet the turkey. Yes, the same bird bound for Thanksgiving plates today was in Mesoamerica a sacred emblem of abundance and ritual. Turkeys were raised for sacrifices, companionship, and this may astonish you, even conversation. Some texts claim the ancients believed turkeys sensed spiritual auras and responded to human energy. If you've ever stared at a turkey and felt it tilt its head in reply, don't be shocked. It may have been appraising your aura. What unites all these tales? Across continents, from China to Mexico, people believed pets were more than animals. They were symbols, bridges between the mundane and the divine. Each fish, each dog, each turkey was loved and entrusted with a role: friend, keeper of secrets, portal between life and death. Is it not ironic? While many ancient empires sacrificed humans in grand rites, they embalmed cats, decked out dogs in gold, and even built temples to turkeys. In Egypt, a cat's death could spark a spiritual crisis, while a slave's passing might garner only a sigh. In the contest for affection, these humble creatures triumphed overwhelmingly. And if you assume only the wealthy, pampered pets, think again. From Chinese housewives to Aztec warriors, everyone reserved a corner of their heart for their animals. The Chinese even composed love poems for crickets. Your autumn serenade in the night rings like pearls beneath the moon. In other words, pets did more than live alongside humans. They lived within our consciousness, our beliefs, and our art. Every soft paw step of a cat, each rooster's dawn crow, each trembling cricket song was given soul and woven into the cosmos. And so, over millennia, from distant lands to your quiet pre-bedroom sanctuary, the love between people and pets endures. Only now, our expressions of that love grow ever more delightfully eccentric. You return to the present, but your luggage isn't a suitcase. It's a collection of strange tales, from the red-haired female pirate to sacred mead, from cloaked Egyptian cats to the Valhalla goat that pours honeyed ale as if Odin himself installed a coffee machine. And you can't forget the singing crickets kept in ivory boxes, or the Latin-speaking parrot skewering Seneca with a sour tone. History, as you see, isn't written only by crown wearers or sword bearers. Sometimes it's penned by the stubborn, those who dare raise a cup, wield a brush, or even grip a cat's paw to sign an unreadable proclamation. They may not grace textbooks, but their laughter, their songs, and the occasional hiccup after a rowdy feast still echo through time. Think of Anne Bonny, the woman deemed too dangerous to hang because she was pregnant. A most elegant dodge of the gallows, wouldn't you say? Or Bastet, the cat goddess with more statues than any nation-builder pharaoh. Proof that cats always win, even in the hereafter. You've also learned that history is a charming collection of paradoxes. For example, the ancient Greeks, the founders of logic and philosophy, seriously believed that drinking undiluted wine was a mark of barbarism. Meanwhile, the Vikings thought that with enough mead, you'd earn yourself a seat at the gods' always full feast, where vomiting was part of the welcome ceremony. In Egypt, you risk mob punishment if you accidentally step on a cat's tail. In Mesoamerica, eating turkey might be a sacred rite, or a gesture of friendship, depending on which side of the ritual blade you stand. And in China, they kept fish for meditation, crickets for relaxation, and dogs, not to guard the home, but to stave off loneliness while you sipped wine and composed Tang poetry. Have you ever drunk alongside a cricket? It's unforgettably invigorating. Each civilization, each era, leaves its mark, or a spilled drink, on history's tablecloth. But it's those drops of wine, those stories, that bring the tapestry to life. Not just victories, but seemingly small moments. The empty cup of a pyramid builder, the royal swipe of a divine cat's whiskers, or a medieval cupbearer daring to tell a joke during Mass. And you realize, history never truly ends. It's an all-night party with a place for everyone, if only you have the patience to listen. For sometimes, what makes us remember the past isn't blood and steel, but the laughter that peels through the absurd. So what do you think, when the forgotten still resound across time? Before you drift to sleep, leave a comment. Which story struck you most? And remember, history awaits your discovery tomorrow night. Sleep well.